Many of you expressed interest in talking about amplification when I sent out that survey a while ago asking you all what you'd be interested in learning about. And so I thought let's do a quick video now talking about amplifying ourselves in live situations. Welcome to Learn Jazz Bass with Matt Rybicki. I'm glad that you're here. So as I said, many of you wanted to talk about amplification, and I thought let's talk about some basic ideas that might help us on the gig and some things to think about. Now, of course, your particular equipment is going to be different than what I have, and so you'll have to make your own judgment on some of this stuff. But there are some broad ideas that hopefully might be helpful. The first thing is to think about what we are trying to do when we're using an amplifier. And ideally, in the traditional jazz setting, we just want to take the natural acoustic sound of this instrument and just make it louder. We don't want to color it at all. That is tough to do, and there is sort of an endless search, right, to try to get that. I totally understand that part. I'm still searching myself. Nonetheless, amplification is an important part and a necessary part of many gigs and part of our lives. So what can we do to try to make it better when we are playing? If you have that ideal situation where everything is just right and you have sensitive players who come down to your volume and so on and so forth, you can get a really beautiful experience with an amplifier. But ideally, we're trying to, because we are trying to rely on it as little as possible. We'd like to get as much of the natural sound coming from the source as is possible. And we want that to sort of be the overriding sound that one would hear. That oftentimes isn't the case or can't be the case, especially because many players aren't very sensitive to the volume that we need to be at. Great players will come down to the bass player. Everybody will. It'll be so great. Someday it'll happen for you, I promise, if it's not already, and it's fantastic. Nonetheless, when we're dealing with a situation that is loud and we need to hear ourselves better, what can we do to make that sound passable or practical or usable or even sometimes pleasant? And I think one good place to start is to think about assessing the room when you get in. If it is this is probably very obvious to you, if it's a very, very big room, that is very different than if it's a carpeted living room, right? That makes a huge difference in the kind of settings you have. And so no matter the scenario that you're in, it makes sense to both think about giving yourself time to assess your sound from the amplifier by yourself ahead of time before you actually are performing. Also, you want to try to get other people involved playing if you can, because the sound that you will just get by yourself will be colored by the other players, especially drummers when you're close to a drummer, and a whole host of other things. You also want to, if you can, have time to sort of keep plugged into the amplifier, have somebody else play it if they can, or very easily just step away from the amplifier so that you can hear better the sound that others are hearing as well. We want to hear ourselves, but we also want the sound to reflect us well. We want to reflect good on ourselves. We want to make ourselves sound good. Gosh, I really stumbled there. Nonetheless, so those are some things that sort of practically you want to do when you get to the gig. There's also the possibility when you're dealing with overall sound that you can take the amplifier off of the floor, can make a tremendously big difference in the overall sound. Right now, I've got an amplifier that I'm plugged into that is off the ground, and this makes a big difference in this particular amp. And depending on the situation, it may or may not help. It depends on the scenario, but that is something to keep in mind. Just putting it on a chair oftentimes is enough. Just get it actually off the floor. As you may know, somebody like Ron Carter and some other players will actually take an amplifier and put it on some kind of stand. So it's quite high, so it's more ear level. And that can work for some people. And in fact, it can work very well for some people. So that may be something to consider. But where the amp is also affects things. As far as the actual settings of the amplifier frequencies and so on go, you can do a couple things when you first get to the gig. Of course, you can just turn it on, and that's the easiest and simplest, most sort of logical thing to do. Wherever the settings were, that's where you assess you need to go or change from there. But oftentimes it can be helpful to completely sort of wipe the chalkboard clean and set everything to 0. So take a look at my amplifier here, and you can see with this second camera I've got set up that everything is essentially at 0. This particular model, which is a Phil Jones Session 77, has the number 0 there. Everything is just at its medium place, including the volumes, and it's on mute. So here is the acoustic sound of the instrument, I mean with a microphone, but without the amplifier. Uh, and now if I turn the amplifier on just with the settings that it's on, and that's fine. There's not actually much volume, at least from my perception in the room. So I know that this particular amp can, in the instance that it is right now, it can really pick up a lot of sort of extraneous electrical noise. There's not some kind of ground button on it that would reduce some of that. And this particular pickup, which is the David Gage Realist Lifeline, I think there's something wrong with this particular pickup, to be totally honest. I'm not getting as much volume out of here as I expect naturally. So if I turn the volumes up here on the amplifier itself, you'll start to hear some buzzing. You hear that? And we don't necessarily want that, although you may have to live with it on the gig, but this is going to be too loud now. That said, given the situation, you may need to be that loud. I hope you never do have to get that loud. So what I'm going to do is turn off the actual volume back down a little bit lower. I may increase them a little bit, but I want to reduce that buzz. And what I'm going to do instead in this particular instance, where I want overall volume to be higher, is I'm actually going to take the frequencies and boost them, which also gives the benefit of volume. So if I turn it up, let's say whatever that is, to 9 o'clock, I'm hearing more buzzing, which I don't love, but I definitely got more volume out of that. But I still don't love this buzzing. There's not a whole lot I can do in this instance. I've got a bunch of cables running underneath me. They're crossing over each other and so on and so forth. I know my house isn't particularly shielded for this and so on and so forth. But so let's hopefully just sort of ignore that for now, ignore that buzzing for now, and think about changes that we can make to the actual frequency knobs that don't have to do with volume. One thing I want to bring to your attention is a concept, a couple concepts related to sort of wiping the slate clean, if I didn't mention that earlier, where you are zeroing all the knobs. I think I said that earlier. Those were essentially all zeroed. And then you can reduce from there as opposed to add. So if you have too much bass, rather than adding more treble and mids, reduce the bass. It's a very, very simple thing, but as a rule of thumb, that's a good place to start. However, given a particular environment or a particular amplifier or setup between bass and amplifier, that may not necessarily be the easiest thing to do. So conversely, you can also cut all the frequencies. So if I cut every single frequency down to 0, so I'm reducing it overall, I don't have a lot of volume, but I can add what I want instead of taking something away, and that may get me to where I want to be quicker. If I go back to, let's say, I'm zeroed again, and this is a pretty decent sound. It's not terrible, but let's say I want to feel like I've got more bottom in the overall sound. As I going this with the idea of reduction, I'm going to turn the treble down as opposed to turning the other things up. Made a subtle difference, maybe reduce the volume a little bit. You can adjust the volume higher and so on. So that is one thing that may or may not help to start from 0 and go down, or cut everything down and then go up. The other thing that is counterintuitive, and I know not a lot of people necessarily love the sound of it, meaning the sound of the idea, which is to cut off every frequency but the low end, especially for upright. This doesn't so much work necessarily on electric, but sometimes in certain situations, just having the bottom end is all we actually really need, and is sometimes the best sound, even if it's a little muddy or thumpy. And to that end, let's talk about the different frequencies and how we might think about them. That low end is going to give us that bottom that we want, but can be, as I say, can either be sort of muffled or just very hard to hear a pitch, for example. So if I turn the bass way up, turn the others way down, so the bass is like all the way. That's a lot of bottom, which sounds actually really great coming from this amplifier, considering it's not a very big amplifier, but it's too much, right? And you can't really hear the pitch as easily as you can just feel that sensation of air moving, which can be very important sometimes. Nonetheless, that's obviously too much. So we want to consider that we want that bottom, but we don't want it to be muddy. We don't want it to overpower the actual pitch. To hear pitch, you want to think about the mids, either just if they're on my amp, there's just one mids here. Oftentimes there's a low mid or a high mid, or you might have a parametric or graphic EQ. But that middle of the road is where we're going to get more of the clarity. Our ears, the human voice is in the like 1,000 to 2,000 kilohertz range, I think, or maybe 2 to 3. That's like the mids. And so that's going to give more clarity to the pitch, but if it's by itself, you're going to not have body and it's not going to have life. Check it out. If I turn the mids all the way up and turn the treble and the bass all the way down, we get this. The missing that bottom end, missing life, sounds like it's not inside a can or you're listening through a wall or something. That's not what we want either. But there's a lot of buzz there. But emphasizing that frequency range is going to give us more clarity on the pitch itself. If there's not like life to the sound, that's where you want some treble in there, but you don't want to overdo it. Too much treble, you're going to get sort of a brittly metallic sound and a lot of string noise, and that's not going to be pretty to listen to. We generally want a warm sound, and that's not going to give it to us. Check out all treble. So if I turn the treble all the way up and both of the other ones all the way down, turn the volumes up a little bit so you can hear a little more. There's so little coming out of there because it's such a small, frequency. Sort of the idea of it is sort of very precise. It doesn't help the volume really at all. It doesn't give the sense that anything's going out. So that's just going to add a sense of like life to the sound and a sense of a little bit more clarity. Don't overdo it, especially on other amplifiers can really make an ugly sound from this setting. So I'm going to reset this back to 0 now and think about, as I say, which thing you need to emphasize given the scenario that you're in and the room that you're in and the sound that you want. I'm zeroed out here. It sounds pretty good from where I'm standing. My amplifier is right next to me. If I walked further away, I might not like it. I might want to make an adjustment. I also want to think about, as I said, playing with other people. When that drummer gets in there, chances are you're not loud enough because most drummers are too loud. So you want to, consider that you may have to put the volume up some, but again, try to not do it too much, right? Like don't just bash people over the head with your volume. Additionally, you have to think about what instruments are playing will affect potentially which frequencies you need to emphasize. Here's why, because on the drums, the tom-toms, especially the low tom, exist in a frequency that will cover up our frequencies on the upright, especially acoustically, it will cover them up. So if there's music, some Latin music, for example, or certain old sort of big band music and stuff where there's just a lot of that show-off thing on the low toms with sticks, will completely swallow us up. So you have to sort of understand that's coming, and you may have to compensate by trying to emphasize one of the other frequencies more than just what the default acoustic frequency of it is. If you're only playing Latin music, in fact, a lot of Latin bass players sound there's a lot of low end to me, on a lot of their sort of generic sound. And that's great. I love it a lot. Like I love listening to that a lot. Like the baby bass is like all low end, if you know what I'm talking about with the baby bass. Nonetheless, that's one thing to consider. What drums are the drummers playing, actually, and the kit will affect if we're covered up. Additionally, a guitar player exists in the frequencies a lot of the frequencies of the bass. And so a guitar player, even if it's partially, a semi-hollow body guitar, if it's amplified at all, it is going to interfere with our frequencies. And so you have to take that into account and sort of try to adjust accordingly. You can either try to scoop out that part, so you might maybe reduce the mids, and so you're gonna have to live with more lows and highs, or maybe just bash them over the head with lows, I don't know. But something to compensate for that actual instrumentation is an important way of thinking about what you're doing. Additionally, might be super obvious, but if you find a setting that you like, you can take a picture of it with your phone. You can put a mark on the amp as to where the knobs go. Although I have found on many occasions that what I thought was the perfect sound, and was in that particular moment, the very next day it is awful in the other space that I've gone into. So you have to be flexible and be willing to sort of think about how you want to use these particular frequencies. Sometimes as well, you just can't get what you want. And nothing you do will end up being what you want. And over time, that can lead you to sort of making more dramatic decisions about your setup. But oftentimes it's just part of the deal and you just got to kind of live with it. My default is, if I'm not happy with the sound and it's just not working no matter what setting I do, I want to put a lot of low end in there just so I feel like at least people can feel me, if not really hear the pitches that I am playing. As I said, you getting it off the ground, getting it closer to your ear can make a difference in that. And if something is very muddy, if you're hearing a lot of low ends, that's going to make a big difference lifting it off the ground. But you just have to take into account that if you are playing this instrument with an amplifier, there's very little you can do to totally control the situation unless you're Ron Carter. That said, I also want to sort of put in my 2 cents as far as what all we're using as far as in the signal chain. Like, yes, there are very powerful tools as far as preamps and so on and so forth that we can use. And some folks have a mic going and 2 different pickups and so on and so forth. And I've actually used that to some certain success in a certain scenario. But in my opinion, the less you have in the signal chain, the more you're going to be able to get to an authentic sound, which is what we want. Like, the more knobs you have to mess with, the less it's going to sound more like your bass naturally. So to return back to that original thought, what we're just trying to do is take the sound of this instrument and make it louder for the times that we need it. So thanks for joining me today. I hope that it was helpful and that some of this information can serve you well on gigs to come. Look for a link below for a PDF related to amplifiers, and always remember, straight ahead and strive for tone.